In this video, we're going to look at Agenda, which is a lightweight job scheduler for Node.js. An agenda simplifies the management of background jobs or scheduled tasks that need to be periodically executed. And these can range from very simple tasks like sending out emails to more complex operations like data processing and generating reports. So if you have, for example, a weekly report that needs generated, you can schedule that code to run once a week using a tool such as Agenda. So we're going to dive into Agenda in this video. We're also going to see how it integrates with MongoDB for persistence of data relating to your jobs. And finally, we'll also show how to monitor the status of our jobs with BetterStack and respond to any incidents that occur. So let's dive in and get started. Now we're on the GitHub page for Agenda, and as it says on the right hand side, this is a lightweight job scheduling package for Node.js. So in order to code along with this video, you're going to need to have Node.js installed, and we're also going to need to install MongoDB. So let's go down to the README and we're going to find out why that is. You can see that when you install Agenda, it includes a MongoDB driver. And if we scroll down again to what Agenda offers, one of the many things it offers is a MongoDB-backed persistence layer. So all of the data around the jobs that you define, including the schedules, they are stored in MongoDB, and that ensures that your tasks are not lost during application downtime. And that emphasizes that Agenda is a very reliable tool. And it offers different scheduling options with priorities and concurrency, as well as scheduling via cron or human readable syntax. We're going to dive into all of those in this video. Now, because we need MongoDB to be installed, I'm going to install that now, and I'm going to use Docker to do that. We're going to use the Mongo image from Docker Hub. If you're not interested in how to set up MongoDB, there are some sections in the video. You can skip to the section on Agenda after we set up this MongoDB container. But if you want to see how to set this up with Docker, we can copy the docker pull command, and I'm going to open a terminal here on VS Code, and we're going to paste that in there, and that's going to pull the latest MongoDB image from Docker Hub, and we can then use that image to start a MongoDB container. Now if we go back to Docker Hub and scroll down here, we have an example command to start a MongoDB server. We're going to copy this, and I'm going to paste it back into VS Code, and we're going to change this up a little bit. So first of all, I'm going to change the name of the running MongoDB container. I'm going to call this one AgendaDB. And we can keep the container running in detached mode, but I'm also going to add a port mapping here. Now MongoDB runs on this port normally, so we're going to map that port on the host into the container so that we can connect to the container from our jobs.js JavaScript file here. So basically the agenda code can access the running database within the container. So let's add that port mapping, and finally we're just going to add Mongo. That's the name of the image that we've just pulled. So this command is going to start a MongoDB container, and it's going to give you back the container ID. And if we now run the docker ps command, you can see that that container is running now. So we can actually connect to that from our JavaScript code. Now we have an empty JavaScript file here. It's called jobs.js. We're now going to install Agenda, but in order to do that, we need an npm project. So I'm going to run the npm init command, and that's going to create the package.json file on the left-hand side. And then if we clear the terminal, we're going to go back to the GitHub page for Agenda, and I'm going to scroll down here to the installation section, and this will be linked below the video. We're going to copy this installation command and go back to VS Code, and I'm going to paste that in here, and that's going to install Agenda in this project. Now once that's finished installing, we can actually use Agenda in our code. So at the top here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to import Agenda, and that's going to be from the Agenda package. And below that, I'm going to create a MongoDB connection string, and I'm going to paste that in here. So we're using MongoDB as the protocol, and we're connecting on localhost, and we're using that default port, so we don't need to explicitly add the port here. And the name of the database is going to be Agenda. Now you can call that anything you want, but I'm going to call it Agenda. What we can then do is we can actually create a new object. So we're going to instantiate the Agenda object that we imported at the top, and we can pass some configuration to that. So I'm going to pass an object in JavaScript, and it's going to have a key of DB, and that's going to allow us to configure the database. So for example, we can set the address to that Mongo connection string that we created on line 3. And as well as that, we can also tell Agenda what collection within that database to store the information about the jobs. So I'm going to give this a name of agenda jobs. And if you're not familiar with MongoDB, a collection in MongoDB is the equivalent of a table in a relational database. So this is like a table, but it's going to store a document format, basically very similar to JSON data. And the name of our collection for agenda is going to be called agenda jobs. Now at this stage I'm going to save the file, and on the terminal at the bottom I'm going to run the node command, and we're going to execute this jobs.javascript file. Now you can see we're getting an error that we cannot use an import statement outside of a module. Now there's a simple way to fix this. If we go to package.json, we can add a key here to the package.json file called type, and we're going to set that to a value of module, and that's going to allow us to use this syntax here to import things from different packages. So once you've added that, you can save package.json and we can clear the terminal, and I'm going to try running this again. So we're going to run jobs.js, and this time we're not getting an error when we try to import agenda here. Now let's go back to GitHub now, and we're going to look at how to define an agenda task or a job. What we need to do is we call a function called agenda.define, and we give the job that we're about to define a name, and then there is a callback function, which can be an asynchronous JavaScript function that defines the logic for the job. And once we've defined the job, we've given it the name. In this case it's called delete old users. What we can then do at some point in our application is call the agenda.start method, and that's going to start the job processor. And once we've started that, we can define a schedule for a particular job. For example, in this case we have the delete old users job, and we're scheduling that every 3 minutes. And we use the agenda.every function and pass in a time frame of 3 minutes, and you can see that that's a very human readable way of defining the time or the schedule in which the task should run. And we can also do this with cron syntax. Now what I'm going to do is go back to the terminal, and we're going to define a very simple task here. So it's the agenda.define function, and I'm going to give that task a name of welcome, and we can define a callback function now that's going to define the logic executed in this task. And I'm just using a JavaScript arrow function here, and we're going to console log welcome to agenda. So it's a very simple task. What we're going to do now is we're going to call the agenda.start method, and we can await that returning so that we know agenda is up and running. We know it's connected to MongoDB. And what we're going to do is we're going to call agenda.every, and I'm going to define a task that runs every 5 seconds. So the time frame, the interval that we're passing in here, is 5 seconds, and the second parameter is the name of the task that we want to run every 5 seconds, and that's the task that we called welcome when we used that agenda.define function. And that's most of the code that we need here. What I'm going to do at the bottom is add some more code that's going to call agenda.stop, and I'm just going to paste this in here. It's not particularly important, but it does clean up the tasks that we have when we exit the script. So what we have is a function called graceful that calls agenda.stop and then calls process.exit and passes a status of 0. And then at the bottom here we are listening for 2 events, and that's the sigterm and sigint event. So that's basically the termination of the node script or the interruption of the node script. And when we get those signals, we are calling that graceful method, and that's going to clean up agenda by calling the agenda.stop function. Now what we're going to do is save this file, and I'm going to run this script at the bottom here. So let's run jobs.js, and you can see we're getting the output here, welcome to agenda, and that is running every 5 seconds. So we're expecting to see more of these, and it's going to run indefinitely every 5 seconds and print that output to the terminal. So that is how easy it is to define a task in agenda. We use the agenda.define method, we define the task in a JavaScript function, and then we schedule that task using a method such as agenda.every, and the task is then going to run on the time frame or the interval that we pass in. Now I'm going to stop the script at the bottom, and I'm going to expand the terminal. What I want to do is show you the MongoDB database. So we've got a MongoDB container that's running, and that's got this ID here. I'm going to copy that container ID, and we're going to run the docker exec command, and we're basically going to run a command inside of the MongoDB container. So we're passing -ti so we can interact with the terminal, and we pass in the container ID, and the command that I want to run inside of the container is the Mongo shell command. So if we go to the browser for a second, the MongoDB shell, which is called MongoSH, this is a JavaScript and Node.js environment for interacting with MongoDB locally or on a remote host. And we can use this shell to test queries and interact with the data in our MongoDB database. So let's execute this, and that's going to return to us the MongoDB shell. And you can see that by default, we have a database here called test. Now, if we go back to the code and we look at the Mongo connection string, the database that we are using for agenda, we've actually called that database agenda. So what I'm going to do is use a command here, and it's the use command, and we can switch to a new database using that command, and the database we're switching to is agenda. And then we can run a command called show collections, and that's going to show all of the collections in this database. And we can see the one we have here called agenda jobs, and that corresponds to this collection name that we used when we created the agenda object. So we have that collection. What we're now going to do is we're going to query that database, and we're going to query that collection to find out what data we have in there from agenda. So we can use the DB object in MongoDB for these queries, and then you can put the name of the collection that you want to query against after that, and ours is called agenda jobs. And if we then run .find with no arguments, that's going to return to us all of the data in that collection. And you can see we have what looks like a JavaScript array here with a single object. And this object defines our task. You can see it's got a name of welcome. And you can see, for example, the repeat interval is set to 5 seconds. So agenda has stored the information it needs on this task in the MongoDB collection. And when we stop the application and then start it up again, agenda can then go and read the collection, and it can then run the jobs whenever it needs to. For example, in the case of our welcome task, every 5 seconds. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear the terminal here. I'm going to get out of the MongoDB container, and we're now going to define a more useful task, and that's a web scraping task that's going to scrape the top articles from Hacker News. So just underneath the welcome task, what I'm going to do is use the agenda.define method, and the task this time is going to be called scrape Hacker News, and again we define the callback function, and this is going to have the logic for the task. Now we're going to scrape Hacker News. If you're interested, we also did a Python video on this topic, on scheduling tasks that are going to scrape Hacker News, and that should be appearing on the screen now. Now in order to scrape data using Node.js, we're going to install a new package. And the package is JSDOM, and this is a JavaScript implementation of various web standards for use with Node.js. So let's go back to VS Code, and I'm going to run the npm install command, and we're going to install JSDOM in this project. And at the top of the file, I'm going to import that here. So we're importing the JSDOM object from that package, and then we can define the logic inside of this task. Now let's go to the browser, and I'm going to go to this page here on Hacker News. This page contains the articles that we want to fetch. We want to scrape this data, and we're going to sort the articles from the top to the bottom so we get the most popular articles first. So I'm going to copy the URL here, and we're going to go back to VS Code. And what we need to do is we need to get a response, and we're going to call the fetch function in JavaScript and pass in that URL. And because we're awaiting the response here, we need to make this an async function. And then once we have the response, we can get the HTML code. And to do that, we're going to call response.text. Now, if you've worked with JSON APIs, you might be familiar with response.json. What response.text will do is it will convert the byte stream into plain text, which can then be parsed as HTML. And once we have that HTML, we can use JSDOM to parse the document. So I'm going to create a variable here called document, and we can instantiate JSDOM and pass the HTML into that. And in order to get back the document object, we can follow the reference to the window property, and on the window there is a document object. Now we can use this document in order to scrape data from Hacker News. I'm going to go back to the page here, and I'm going to inspect the DOM. What we need to scrape is each table row, and you can see the table row for the very first row in this document. It's got a class of a thing, and every table row that contains the article has this class, and then there is a second row, and you can see if you look at the left hand side here, the row after that contains the number of points that the given article has. Now we need to look at both of these rows, so I'm going to start by getting all of the rows with the class name of a thing. We can go back to VS Code for this, and I'm going to create a variable here called article titles, and we're going to use that document object, and we're going to call a method called querySelectorAll. And this method takes a selector, and the selector that we are using is the class of a thing, and that's going to give us back a node list containing all of these articles. To convert that to a normal JavaScript array, we can use the spread operator like this. So this is going to give us a JavaScript array with all of the rows that have this class name. Now we need to get the next sibling for each of these rows in order to get the number of points. So if we look at the very first row here, we have a table row, and then we have the next sibling of that. It's another table row, and that's the one that contains the points, and that structure is repeated on the web page. So in order to do this, in order to get the next sibling, what we're going to do is we're going to take all of these article titles, and we're going to call the JavaScript map function in order to get the article scores. And we're going to use article titles here, and we're going to call .map on each of those. And for each article that we get back, we can use the article.nextSibling property to get the next sibling in the DOM. And that means that for each one of these table rows that you see here, we're going to get back another JavaScript array that has all of the next siblings, in other words, all of the rows that contain the number of points. So that's going to give us back both of them, and we can then use those objects to find the data that we need in the document. So let's start with the article titles. Let's go back to the page, and the table rows that have that class, we're looking for this anchor tag here. This contains the href property that has the link to the article, as well as the inner text that contains the name of this posting. So we need to look at this table row here and get the span with the class of title line, and then the anchor tag that's the immediate child of that span. So let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to write this out now. And I'm going to create a variable called links here because we're fetching these anchor tags. And again, we're going to take the article titles, and we're going to call the .map method. And for each article, we're going to then call article.querySelector in order to find this child anchor tag. So we're going to look at the title line, that was the span that was above the anchor tag. And then from the title line, we can get the anchor tag that's the immediate child of that with this selector here. We can do the same for the scores. So I'm going to create a variable called scores. And we're going to take the article scores here, and again, we're going to call .map. And for each score, we are going to return another query selector. So let's go back to the page, and this time we're looking at the next table row that contains the points. And what we need to get here is the span with the class of score. That contains the text with the number of points for that article. So we're going to target that now. So let's take the score, and again, we're going to call .querySelector, and we want to find the element with the class name score. So we're building up the code here for our agenda task. I'm going to do some console logs here. We're going to print the very first element of each of these two arrays, and we're going to get the text content just to make sure that this is working. Now, in order to run the task, it's called Scrape Hacker News. We need to go down here, and I'm going to comment out the welcome task, and I'm actually going to copy that line to the line below, and this time we're going to rename the task here to Scrape Hacker News. And what this is going to do is schedule our new task that's trying to scrape that data every 5 seconds. So let's save this, and let's open up the terminal again, and I'm going to run node.jobs.js. That's going to start the task, and hopefully we're going to see some of these console logs. Now at the moment we're still getting the console logs for the welcome to agenda task, and that's because, remember, that was stored in the MongoDB database. So when we start agenda here with the agenda.start method, it's going to pick that up and start running that task. Now I'm going to stop the terminal because we're not getting these console logs, and the reason for that, I think, is because we've called that link. It should be called links so that this will actually work here at the bottom. So let's now save that again. I'm going to expand the terminal, and I'm going to run node.jobs.js, and we see the welcome to agenda message, but we're also getting back the other data from the web page. So we can see the very first article here in Hacker News, and we can also see the number of points for that article. So this is now working. We are scraping that data from Hacker News, and we have it now stored in 2 lists in JavaScript. So I'm going to stop this task, and what we're going to do now is we want to produce a data structure for each one of the articles. Now I'm going to go to the bottom of the script here, and basically what we want to produce for each article in Hacker News, we want to create a JavaScript object with the name of the article, with the URL of that article, and also the score. So that's the structure that we want to create. So we're going to need to create an array of JavaScript objects here, and we're going to need to loop over each of the links and the scores in order to build up that object. So let's clear the console logs. We know that those are working now. We have the data from the web page. And what I'm going to do is create a variable called articles, and we're going to take the links that we have above, and that's a JavaScript array, and we're going to map over each one of those. And I'm going to get the link itself, but we can also get the index while we are iterating over those links, and we can define the logic for each one of those in a callback function here. So what we want to return here is a JavaScript object for each of the links, and one of the things we want is the name of the article. In order to get the name from the link, which remember is an anchor tag, we can use the link and we can call, or rather we can access the .text content property. So if you have a DOM node in JavaScript, in order to get the text within that, you can reference .text content. And from the anchor tag, we can also get the URL. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that link and we can access the .href property to get the URL for that anchor tag. And the final thing we need is the score. Now we have access to the index as we iterate through the links, and we can use that index to actually index into the scores array as well. So I'm going to take that scores array and we're going to go to that index that we are currently at, and that's going to return the content in the span that you see here. So we have this span element. What we need to get is the text within that, and in this case that says 35 points. So in order to get the text, again, we can just access the .text content property, but this might not always exist on Hacker News. If we go back to the page here, I don't know if there are any examples, but sometimes a Hacker News article might not have any points. And in that case, what's going to happen is this is going to cause a problem. So what I'm going to do is use this expression in JavaScript. We can add a question mark here before we access the .text content property, and if .text content is not defined on what this returns, it's not going to run that. And what I'm going to do is use the OR operator here, and if we don't find something that has a .text content property, we're going to set the default value to 0. And I think that's all we need to write here. So for each one of the articles, it's going to return this JavaScript object. Let's test this out just below here. I'm going to console log the very first article here, so we can index in at element 0, and I'm going to run the node jobs.js command at the bottom, and hopefully we're going to see some output here, and we do get some output. So we're now seeing the JavaScript object with the data that we need. It's got the name of the article, it's got the URL, and it also has the points. Now I want to sort by the points, so we need to make sure that this is always a numerical value. So I'm going to use some string logic here in order to extract just the number from that text. So let's go back to the code, and let me start by moving this into a variable. So let's create a variable within the callback function called score, and we can extract that to that variable. And then we can set the score variable in this object here. So what we're going to do is we're going to check if the type of this score is equal to a string. So if the type of the score is a string, what we want to do here is we want to split the string, and we only want to get back the first element after we split on that space. So what we're going to call is score.split, and we're going to index in at element 0 after we've split the string on the space, and that's going to give us back the string with the number, in this case 42. And in order to convert that to an integer, we can call the parseInt function in JavaScript. Now if the type of score is not a string, that means it might have returned the default value, which is an integer. So in that case, we have a number anyway, so we can just return the score. So this logic to split the string and parse it as an integer will only be applied if the type of the score is already a string. Otherwise, it's just going to return the score as it is. So we're making progress here. We now have articles. We have a JavaScript object for every article on Hacker News, and we have a numerical score. We now want to sort this array on the score. Now we can call a function on JavaScript arrays, and that's the .sort function. And that takes in a compare function that accepts two arguments, and that's the two items being compared, and then it will return some sort of ordering on those items. Now the return value from this callback should be a number whose sign indicates the relative order of the two elements. If the return value is negative, that means that A is going to be less than B in the ordering. If the return value is positive, that means that A is greater than B. And if they have the same value, that will return 0. So that's how this works. What we need to do is we need to take each of the articles, and we're going to look at the score in those articles. So what we're going to return here is b.score minus a.score, and that is going to sort these objects in the array from the highest score to the lowest score. So let's go down here, and again I'm going to console.log the very first element in the articles array. So we index in at 0, and I'm going to copy that line of code, and let's get the very last element. So what we're going to do is we're going to get articles.length and subtract 1 here to get the last element in the articles array. Let's save that, and we're going to go back to the terminal. I'm going to clear this out and rerun the command. And this time we get back 2 items. You can see we have the top item, because this is now sorted, and that has a very high score of 1073, and the bottom item has a score of 0. So now we have the articles ordered, And basically we have a top to bottom list of all of these articles on the front page of Hacker News. Now the last thing I want to do in the agenda task is actually save the top 5 to the file system. So let's say that in our task we want to export a JSON file that can then be viewed by other people or imported into another process. What we're going to do is go to the top here. I'm going to bring in this import from Node.js, and that's the file system module. And then if we go back down to the bottom here, I'm going to remove the console.log statements, and we're going to use the file system's write file sync method. And the first parameter to that is the name of the file that we want to write to, and I'm going to call the file toparticles.json. And let's say we want to take the articles and we only want to write the top 5 as JSON. What we can do to get the top 5 is call the .slice function, and we're going to slice from element 0 to element 5. And we can use the JavaScript JSON.stringify function to convert those JavaScript objects to JSON data. Now we're passing the articles as the value to JSON.stringify. The second parameter to that function is a replacer. Now we don't need to do any replacement here, but there is a third argument that I want to define, and that's the space argument. I'm going to put the tab character in here, and that's going to format the outputted JSON into a nice indentation so that we can read it better on the file system. So let's clear the terminal and rerun jobs.js, and hopefully on the left hand side we're now going to see a file called toparticles.json. And you can see that that has now appeared. Let me stop the task here. If we look at this file here, we have the top articles from the one with the highest number of points down to the one here with 177 points. So we have the top 5 articles because we've sliced that array from element 0 to element 5, and they are appearing on the file system. And that is our agenda task. We are sending a request to the Hacker News website. We're parsing the data and scraping the data that we need from that website. And then finally, we're sorting the data from the article with the highest to the lowest points, and we're outputting a new file with the top 5 articles. Let's now move on, and we're going to show some additional features of agenda now. Now it turns out that agenda jobs can have a priority. I'm going to go to the BetterStack guide on job scheduling in Node.js with agenda, and this is a very comprehensive guide to this. What I'm going to do is go to step 4 on the left hand sidebar, and again there'll be a link to this page below the video. If you scroll down here a little bit, you can see some of the details on the priorities. Now this paragraph here is important. When you have more than one scheduled task, you might want to guarantee that one is performed before the other. And that's where setting a priority level comes in handy. And in order to do that, when you define your task with agenda.define, you can pass a JavaScript object, and the key of priority will determine the priority for that task. And some of the priority values that you can use are listed here. We have lowest, low, normal, high, and highest. So let's see an example of that on VS Code. If I go to the top here, we have this very simple welcome to agenda task. I'm actually going to give that a priority of lowest. So we pass in the object with priority set to lowest. All that task is doing is console.logging some information. It's not particularly useful, so we're going to give it a priority of lowest. Now let me copy that, and we're going to go down to the scrape Hacker News task. I'm going to paste that in there, and we can change that to a priority of high. And that's because this task actually does something useful, let's say, and we want to set the priority for this one to be higher. But this is maybe more important if you have two tasks where the output of one task may feed into the next task. You might want to set the priority based on any interdependencies between the tasks. Now before we go on, what I want to do is clear out the existing jobs from the agenda scheduler. And that's just so that they don't run every time that we run the script. So in order to do that, I'm going to go down to that graceful function that we defined earlier on. And after agenda has stopped, I'm going to add another call here, and that's to the agenda.cancel function. And we can pass an object here in order to cancel a particular task. And I'm going to cancel the scrape Hacker News task. And then if we copy that line below, we can also cancel the welcome task when we stop the program. So in other words, when we press Ctrl+C and terminate the program, it's going to run this graceful function, and it's going to remove those entries from MongoDB. Now let's explore schedules in agenda a little bit more, and then soon we're going to show you how to monitor your scheduled tasks using BetterStack. So up until now, we've only scheduled jobs with the interval of 5 seconds. And these are second-based intervals that are used for demonstration purposes. But Agenda does provide some versatile options for scheduling. So let's go back to the BetterStack article. And I'm going to go to step 5 at the left hand side on setting the right schedule frequency. Now you can do this using human readable intervals as well as cron expressions. If we look at the human readable intervals that we have here, you can see intervals such as 1 second, 2 minutes and 15 seconds. You can run a task every 3 days or 3 weeks, or every 1 month and 2 weeks as an example. So a lot of versatility here in how you define the tasks and the schedule for those tasks, and that can be done in a very human readable way. And we also saw at the start that we can also use cron expressions, as you can see here, and that gives you complete control almost over how you schedule these tasks. Now sometimes you might not need the task to run periodically, you might only need it to run once. And there are a couple of functions in Agenda for this. We have a schedule method, and that takes in a time, as you can see here, for example, tomorrow at noon. And once that task executes, because we're using the .schedule function, it's not going to repeat, so it will be a one-off event. And as well as .schedule, if you just need to run something immediately, you can use the agenda.now method. So let's show a very quick example of this. If we go down, or rather go up here to where we are running the Scrape Hacker News task, I'm going to change the function from agenda.every to the schedule function. And I'm going to change the time interval here, let's say in 10 seconds. So we're going to run the script at the bottom, but before we do that, I'm going to remove the top articles.json file. And that's because that is now the output of our task. So if we remove that, we are going to hopefully see it being re-added after 10 seconds. So I'll remove that just now. And once that's gone, we can run the command at the bottom. And hopefully after 10 seconds, we're going to see the top articles.json file appearing on the left-hand side, because our task has been scheduled and it's a one-off schedule. It runs, it generates the file, and then that's it, done. And you can see that now we have the top articles.json file. It's appeared here, which means that the task has run. Now let's move on to the final part of this video. We're going to show how to monitor a task using BetterStack. So let's go to the BetterStack platform, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create what's called a heartbeat. So on the left-hand sidebar, we can click heartbeats and we can create a new heartbeat that's going to allow us to monitor a scheduled task. Now you're asked the question, what service will the heartbeat track? I'm going to give this a name of web scraping job, and we can keep the default of a 30-second heartbeat, and let's give this a grace period of 5 seconds. The grace period refers to the time that the job needs to execute. Now, as well as what's being monitored, you can set up rules for who is going to be notified and how when an incident occurs. So for example, you can get a call or an SMS message or an email or a push notification. You can get those when BetterStack is aware that there's a problem, it's not receiving the heartbeats, and therefore someone will be notified and you can address the issue very quickly. So let's create the heartbeat at the bottom, and once you create that, you get a link here, and we're going to copy that to the clipboard. And what we're going to do in our task is we're going to send a request to that endpoint, and that can be a head, a get, or a post request. And that's going to basically send the heartbeat to BetterStack so that it knows that the task is executing successfully. And if it doesn't receive that heartbeat, it's going to know that there's a problem, and it's going to alert your team and let them know that there is a problem ongoing. So we've got the link here. Let's go back to the script, and what we're going to do is go to jobs.js, and just after we write the data to the file system, we can then send the request, because we know at that point the task has successfully completed. So what we're going to do is we're going to await a call to fetch, and I'm going to paste in that link that I got from the BetterStack platform. Once we've done that, I'm going to go down to the bottom, and I'm going to again change this back to the agenda.every method, and the schedule that we're going to use here, the interval, is going to be 5 seconds. Let's now run the program, and we're going to go back to BetterStack. And you can see on the platform that we have just recorded a heartbeat 10 seconds ago, and that all systems are up here. So our scheduled task is running, the platform is picking up those heartbeats, and it knows that all is well. But if something does go wrong with your scheduled job, BetterStack will find out about that, and it's going to alert your team. So in order to simulate that, what I'm going to do is go back to VS Code, and I'm going to stop this program here. And what that's going to do is it's going to stop sending those requests to the heartbeat endpoint, and therefore after some time BetterStack is going to know that there is a problem with this particular job, and at some point the status of the job is going to change from up to down. And when that happens, you're going to receive alerts on the channel that you configured, for example the email, and that will allow you to address that problem very quickly. And you can see now that the status has changed from up to down, and we now have an ongoing incident on the platform. We've set the schedule that we expect to be sending these heartbeats, but we're no longer sending them, and BetterStack is now aware that there's a problem, and it has sent me an email to inform me of that. And what you can see on the left hand side is that there's another tab for incidents. If we click through to that, you can see all of the incidents that are currently ongoing across all of your services. So this page here is a great way to monitor any incidents if you have lots of scheduled jobs and you want to make sure that everything is running. What you can do is you can create heartbeats for all of the jobs that you want to monitor, and then on this page you can see if there are any incidents that are currently ongoing, and you can also click through to them. For example, this web scraping job here, we can click that and we get taken to the incident page. And this is very useful because we can see if the incident is ongoing, we can see how long it took to resolve, and we can also leave comments for the rest of our team that can help us if we try and detect what might have gone wrong and the process for solving that problem. So the heartbeats and incidents page on BetterStack is very useful for monitoring scheduled tasks and jobs, and that can include things like serverless functions as well. So that's all for this video. We've shown in this video how to use the agenda package in Node.js in order to create scheduled and periodic tasks that can be executed in order to perform some business logic on a schedule. And we've also shown how agenda uses MongoDB under the hood to store information about the tasks, and that gives the tasks a persistence and reliability, and that can be very useful as it means your task data is not lost during application downtime. And we also showed off some web scraping techniques using JSDOM in this video, and also how we can monitor tasks with BetterStack. And if you have any suggestions for similar content, leave them in the comments, and please give the video a thumbs up on YouTube and subscribe to the BetterStack channel if you've not already done so. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.